Hello and welcome to And the Runner-Up Is. This week on the show, we're talking the 1956 Best Actress race at the Academy Awards, where Ingrid Bergman won for her performance in Anastasia. But why did she beat fellow nominees Carroll Baker, Katharine Hepburn, Nancy Kelly, and Deborah Kerr? We'll explore all this and more today on And the Runner-Up Is. Hello and welcome back to And the Runner-Up Is. I'm your host Kevin Jacobson, here to talk about the 29th year of Best Actress at the Oscars, which covered the films of 1956. We'll be discussing why Ingrid Bergman won, why the losers lost, and who we think was the runner-up of this Best Actress race. And my guest today is making her debut on the podcast. She is one of the co-hosts of Untitled Cinema Gals, alongside my friend Chelsea Eichholz, who I've had on the show many times. She is a writer for In Their Own League and Filmotomy. Please welcome to the show, Morgan Roberts.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm very excited to have you to talk about this wild bunch of films.
It's been a roller coaster watching all of these, and so I'm so excited to kind of dive into them.
Yes, well, I appreciate it. But before we talk 1956, let's talk Best Actress as a category. So my first question for you, Morgan, what is your favorite Best Actress win of all time?
So I made a short list.
Oh, good. Okay.
So, I mean, it ranges everything from Julie Andrews and Mary Poppins, because I'm a sucker for that film, to Brie Larson in Room. But I think out of all of them, Judy Holliday in Born Yesterday might be my favorite Best Actress win, because it just is so perfect.
I think that win has been criticized, I would say, to put it lightly, because of who she beat, rather than the performance itself, which is a comedic masterpiece, you know.
It really, and I was introduced to this film by a friend, Finnerty Steves, who was like, this is a great film, you should watch it. And I was like, how has this not been something that I've had on rotation for my entire life? It's just so brilliant and so smart, and Judy Holliday is amazing.
It is, absolutely. Love that choice. But of course, we do love our winners, but we also love our losers. So I would love to know, what would you say is your most heartbreaking loss in Best Actress?
So once again, long list on this one, but I'll just name a couple. I mean, Margot Robbie and I, Tonya is probably the most recent one that hurts. I also really love Audrey Hepburn in Wait Until Dark. That is my favorite Audrey Hepburn film. But number one goes to Jill Clayburgh in An Unmarried Woman.
Yes.
It is the most inspired performance. I know that everyone wants their Gina Rowlands, a woman under the influence moment, but I think that more women should be striving for their Jill Clayburgh time in film.
Adore that performance. I cannot wait to get to 1978 to talk about that whole lineup, because that's it's a great lineup, but God, Jill is just so amazing in that film. Yeah. It's something special. And when I think 1970s, I don't always think about women in Hollywood, because it wasn't the best time, I would say, for female-driven stories in the 70s. But that's one that I always think of as one of the best. So excellent choice. All right, well, let's talk about this year at the Oscars, the 29th Academy Awards. The nominees were Carroll Baker for Baby Doll, Ingrid Bergman for Anastasia, Katharine Hepburn for The Rainmaker, Nancy Kelly for The Bad Seed, and Deborah Kerr for The King and I, with the winner being Ingrid Bergman. So Morgan, before we break down these performances individually, What would you say were some of your overall takeaways just from watching these over the past week or so?
I will say that I feel like 1956, I don't know if were like drugs in the water or something, because these films, there's like no thread where you could kind of even link these films of like, oh yeah, it's, because there are time periods where you're like, oh yeah, of course we're talking about race, or of course we're talking about gender. Like those things are very apparent in the films and performances that are nominated. There is no through line in any of these films or any of these performances, which I think is so great, because it really is just like a swath of what people were doing at the time. But it is a little bit jarring to go from Carroll Baker and Baby Doll to Deborah Kerr and The King and I.
Yes. So this is definitely a wild lineup. I would say just on the whole, no two films are the same here. Two performances are the same. I think we have a wide swath of different acting styles, which will be interesting to sort of contrast here. And I guess it's, in terms of the overall makeup of the actresses themselves, I do think it's a kind of fun mix of, some old favorites like Katharine Hepburn and Ingrid Bergman and Deborah Kerr, with then some newer people like Carroll Baker and Nancy Kelly, both getting their one and only nominations. Ironically, Carroll Baker just getting her start in film, and Nancy Kelly this being her last film. So I feel like there's a lot of different narratives going on here that it's interesting to me that probably the juiciest one is the reason why the winner ended up winning. But I think in a different year, perhaps another narrative could have taken over and won this. So I am very excited to hear your thoughts on all of these different performances, because I have heard good and bad things about each and every one of these performances from other people. So very excited to hear your thoughts. So shall we get into it?
Absolutely.
All right. Well, as we always do, we're starting in alphabetical order, which means we're starting off with Carroll Baker for Baby Doll. So, yes, like I said, we haven't talked about Carroll Baker before, and we won't talk about her again because this is her one and only nomination. So Carroll Baker, she was involved in the Actors Studio. She studied the method under Lee Strasberg, and her first major role was in the movie Giant, which was also in 1956. So she had a really good debut year in film. And this is somewhat based on a Tennessee Williams play called 27 Wagons Full of Cotton. We have Elia Kazan directing, which is this follow-up to, On the Waterfront, which won a bunch of Oscars, East of Eden, which won an Oscar, and then this gets 4 nominations but doesn't win anything. But either way, his films were definitely on a hot streak with the Academy. So let's talk about Baby Doll, though. A very controversial film due to the nature of its content. Pretty sexually suggestive, if not explicit. It's about a middle-aged guy named Archie Lee, played by Carl Malden, who is married to a 19-year-old young woman whose nickname is Baby Doll, played by Carroll Baker, and she was married off to him after her father died, but they had made an arrangement that they could only consummate the marriage when she turned 20, which is the day after the action that takes place in the film. So Archie Lee owns a cotton gin that's being run out of business by his rival Silva, played by Eli Wallach. We have Archie Lee pretty quickly running out of his money, so he resorts to burning down his rival's cotton gin. And so Silva pretty quickly finds out that it's Archie who did it, so he decides to go about proving it, and he goes to Archie's place with all of his cotton and tells him to gin it for him, and he'll pay him. And then in the meantime, he decides to manipulate Baby Doll into confessing that Archie is the one who committed the arson, and the two of them have like a strange sexual chemistry happening that really boils over at a certain point. And then when Archie comes home, things just kind of explode from there. so much to get into with this film, but Morgan, I'd love to know your thoughts on just this performance by Carroll Baker.
Yeah, so I think the important thing to note with this film is that it is not like hot or horny. Like the whole thing is this young woman is being sexually terrorized by two men who are significantly older than her.
Yeah.
And if you frame it like that, then Carroll Baker's performance is so haunting because there are moments where I was just thinking, is she acting or is she truly terrified? Because I was super uncomfortable. So I feel like she understood the assignment because the screenplay was written by Tennessee Williams, who notoriously hates women. He loves to kind of torture them and then be like, why are women so crazy? And you're like, oh, I don't know. Maybe it's because we're being terrorized by men. But she really is like, she kind of captures that innocence and also that she is only seen as a physical commodity sometimes to these men.
Yes. This is a really fascinating one to start with. You know, I hadn't actually seen Baby Doll, even though I've seen quite a bit of the other Tennessee Williams adaptations. Didn't have a lot of experience with Carroll Baker either, but I was actually pretty impressed with her performance here, even though, you know, these kinds of films can have a sort of stylized quality to them. I think she brings a naturalism to the role that is probably, I mean, it's pretty different from all the other nominees here. You know, she's very raw and she feels like an actress who's just getting her start, where there's kind of like an unrefined quality about her. And it definitely didn't shock me at all to learn about the fact that she was a student of the method and a member of the Actors Studio, because this feels very much at home with the kinds of performances that we saw from like Marlon Brando and James Dean and Shelley Winters, Paul Newman, Joanne Woodward, like that whole group. That feels like her crowd as well. And she feels like a new Hollywood type of star and a screen presence. I just think she has this way of, you know, sort of tossing off certain lines or just making it feel improvised in a way, but still sort of keeping control of who she's playing, which is this young woman who's sort of stuck between childhood and adulthood. And she sleeps in a crib because they don't have any furniture, and she's like sucking her thumb in the first scene. She has this sort of petulant way about her sometimes that feels childlike. But she's also at that age where she's able to start making real decisions and she has certain convictions. And I think it's a really, really tricky character to play without sort of infantilizing her too much. You know, she certainly has some naive qualities in some ways where, you know, she says she didn't even make it past the 4th grade, things like that. And she doesn't have a wealth of experience in life by any means, but she sort of is acting on instinct, and she seems to know what she's doing, even if the men around her are trying to control her or manipulate her. And honestly, there really wasn't a moment in the film where I wasn't just totally bought into her performance. Like it felt like a real person to me more so than a performance per se.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Like it was so authentic in what she was bringing that it is kind of like that method acting without it kind of feeling like over the top. Like you were just sold into her understanding of this person.
Right. And she has kind of that petulance about her at times, but she's very clear about her boundaries, you know, and he does cross them quite a bit I'm talking about Archie here. Archie kind of crosses them by trying to sort of violate her in the bathtub. It's kind of an ambiguous scene there. And he's like, you know, peeping in on her and through the peephole. And she's always sort of being leered at. And you can definitely feel, I think this is something along the lines of what you were saying, that feeling of constantly being ogled by men. And just how do you navigate that when you're still trying to become your own person yourself, and you didn't have like a great educational background to really teach you the ways of things. it's very messy, and it's a very uncomfortable film to watch often, but I do find myself sympathizing with her, and I would definitely would agree that it's not really supposed to feel, sexually arousing, I would say. I think the way that she plays it, you feel the discomfort.
Yeah, 100%.
I also want to just talk about the connection with her Aunt Rose Comfort.
Yes.
Mildred Dunnock, which I think is a very interesting sort of relationship that you could say could be taken out, but in a weird way adds this other dimension to the story. What did you think of that story element?
Yeah, I think it kind of continues with the idea of the way that women, and again, I don't think that Tennessee Williams meant to do this on purpose, because he had a very strained relationship with his own mother that kind of created a very prejudiced look at women. But, the aunt character is also kind of someone who's gaslit into believing that she is incapable of making decisions because she is seen as senile. And I think that she kind of helps be, a different side to the same coin as Baby Doll, that it's like, just because she's young, she's not quite 20 yet, she's, seen as this child still, that, that perspective of a woman not being able to make their own decisions doesn't go away, even though both of those women make choices for themselves. I mean, I love the fact that the aunt loves to go to the hospital to get free things. Like, that is a true vibe.
And have chocolate.
And have chocolate. Have,
candy. Yeah, which is fair.
Yeah. And but this is also, they're in the Mississippi Delta. This is not a place of great wealth. So the fact that she's like, hey, if I want something of luxury, I'm going to go to the hospital when people are badly injured or grieving, because I'm going to get a piece of that too. So I find them very interesting characters, because they're at very different stages in their lives, but also having the same scrutinized view from the men in their lives.
Yeah. And I think that's another added dimension to Carroll Baker's performance and character, which is that protectiveness she feels over her aunt and her many references to her father. You feel that sense of pride and comfort, literally, here, Rose Comfort, finding comfort in her family, and just having to deal, whenever she has to deal with strangers, really, it's a, uncomfortable feeling for her. And yeah, I just think she blends those two qualities to the role really well. And then speaking to more of the uncomfortable feelings, the part where Silva is really making these advances on her, I think she really registers this very subtle, uncomfortable shift in the conversation, when at first they're just kind of talking and sort of getting to know each other and having sort of a pleasant conversation. And then when she says that her husband left her in the house and didn't come back for a while, which was the night of the fire, it very quickly changes. And she has that protectiveness and that guardedness that I found very recognizable and realistic. Obviously the scene where he gets close to her and starts to sort of touch her and touch her neck, and she's breathing really heavy. It's very skeevy to watch. I know some people have referred to it as hot.
Yeah.
But it's extremely intimate in a way that I personally haven't come across in a Best Actress nominated performance on this show yet. And it was really difficult to watch in a way. What did you think?
Yeah, because
that porch scene.
Yeah, because I mean, that porch scene, and then kind of later on in the film when he chases her through the house and essentially corners her to a place where she is so close to being physically harmed, that her ability to the men in this film are giving it everything. But I think that she's the one who kind of outshines everyone because she is holding both the naivete of being barely 20 while also understanding, like, she might have a 4th grade education, but she went to the school of hard knocks. Like, she's had to understand how to survive. Right. And so she's holding these two sometimes seemingly contradictory ideas and facets of a person at the same time. And so, like, that porch scene, she makes so many shifts back and forth between, I'm going to allow someone to actually be in my space and, you know, come on to me. And then I'm immediately putting a guard up and he doesn't recognize it, but I do. And I think those subtle changes that she makes in her tone of voice, the way that she's holding herself, the way that she's allowing space to diminish and then creating space is really just astounding.
Yeah. It really is. And this is where you definitely see the naturalism that I talked about of, you know, the actor studio. You really feel her, even if she's not saying anything, she's sort of saying everything just in her expressions. So that's a huge credit to her. And what I find interesting is just how this relationship unfolds, because I don't know if it's a clear black and white type of situation that we have here, where after we've gone through this whole thing of her like torturing her all over the house and like waving things around and horsing around and just like all trying to get her to sign this affidavit to prove that Archie did do this. I feel like there's this sense that she finds that she sort of likes him in a way, but can't really admit it. Is that how you felt?
Yeah, because there's that, it really is the scene that sticks out the most for me in her performance, where he chases her into the attic, which is unstable. And she's basically like holding on to, you know, the frame for dear life. And she laughs a little bit about it and then becomes very terrified and then tries to laugh it off again as he's, you know, coming after her. And it very much is kind of interesting to see her be both amused by his pursuit, because I think that with her husband, his pursuit has always come off as very creepy because it felt like a deal between her dad and him versus now Silva, who is just a third party who's come from nowhere. He doesn't know her or her family. And so she's both amused by the chase and also, you know, within a moment's notice, understanding that there is great danger in this chase. And so I think it's her trying to recognize and reconcile within herself the joy and terror of being chased by a man.
Right. It's, again, another very tricky thing where it's many different things at once, as you're sort of saying. It's just like she doesn't have a whole lot of life experience. She hasn't been around a lot of men, and compared to Archie, who is kind of just this lumbering creep most of the time, you know, Silva, there's something kind of like bad boy dangerous in that, even if obviously what happens is not great with the porch scene, as we were saying. They're both a little bit more on a common ground in a way. Even though he's making these advances on her, they're both sort of navigating the scenes that they have together on somewhat of an equal ground, if that makes sense, compared to, like you're saying, the deal that was made where everything was just arranged for her. Here, it's like she's kind of getting to explore something. And yeah, she navigates that really well.
Yeah.
Even though she admits, like, her daddy would be turning over in his grave.
Yep.
You know?
Yeah, because in essence, I think she recognizes that while Silva's using her, she's also kind of using him to test drive what it means to be an adult with autonomy.
And then, you know, when Archie does come back, I love the kind of almost smug feeling that she gets of knowing that Archie is in trouble, because she, let's be honest, she does not love this man or even like this man at all. So she's really just excited by the idea of him maybe being out of her life, essentially. and she knows that he's about to be caught. And there's kind of like this taunting way about her, this kind of confidence that I found personally fun to watch after this film of her being tortured for so long. There's this feeling of like she knows that there might be a little bit of freedom now possibly to come.
Yeah, absolutely. Like she really is kind of seeing the way that she contests the waters on her own.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. And yes, I love kind of that ending with kind of everyone's in the house at once, and she's the one actually navigating everything because she knows the full picture. Not everyone understands what has or has not transpired. She's the only one who knows what's happening.
Yeah, and I think the film, it's definitely, as you're saying, she does know everything, but the film sort of does just focus into this rivalry between the two of these guys by the end. And I feel like I start to lose my grip a little bit on that character for her, at least in the scenes in the house where it's just the three of them. And it's like Archie getting revenge on Silva for taking Baby Doll away from him to a certain degree. And it becomes about this conflict of these two men rather than her. I feel like there's a little bit of power that's lost in this performance by the end because of the way it does shift a little bit of that focus. And it's like they're both chasing each other around the house. It becomes like a little bit silly by the end, I'll say. But,
yes,
to the end, she's pretty loyal to her family, and she makes sure that her Aunt Rose is okay. And yeah, it's at least she gets that security a little bit in the end.
Yeah, which I think, considering everything that she had gone through, that's all you really want. You just want her and Aunt Rose to be okay.
Yeah, I was very pleasantly surprised with this performance on the whole, despite, again, the wild nature of the film. I think her at the core,
yes,
there's a reason she was singled out, I would say, and the other actors weren't, even though they're both good. But
very much agree with that.
Did you have anything else on Carroll Baker?
I guess the only small adage is that if you do have 3+ hours, do also watch her in Giant, because as you said, this was a big year for her, and she really held her own in both of these very different films.
Very different. Absolutely. All right. Well, let's move on to from a newbie to an old veteran here, Katharine Hepburn in The Rainmaker. So this is her 7th nomination out of 12. So now we're in the latter half of her nominations. And this is one where I don't know if it's as seen as a lot of her other nominations, but it's another interesting one. This is an adaptation of a play, and she's still kind of in this second wind of her career after The African Queen and Summertime, and this is another big showcase role for her, but one that I do think adds some different shadings, playing a more vulnerable character. So she's playing Lizzie, who is this unmarried woman who's living with her brothers and their father in Kansas. And the family really wants her to find a husband, but she feels pretty self-conscious because she's never even had a first kiss. She doesn't feel like a lovable person. And then here comes this guy, Starbuck, played by Burt Lancaster, who says that he's a rainmaker, and he's sort of suggesting that he can conjure up some rain that is very much needed in this dry climate. And some of his family believes him, others don't. But, over time, Lizzie sort of starts to become charmed by him, and they develop this relationship. That's more or less the story without getting too much into it. So, Katharine Hepburn is a legend, as we know. I would love to know your thoughts on her as an actress and what you think of her here as in The Rainmaker.
Yeah, I mean, Katharine Hepburn is, the epitome of, if you want to be an actor who does it all, be Katharine Hepburn, because she's done drama, she's done, romantic comedies, which Bringing Up Baby is one of my favorite of her performances. I had not seen The Rainmaker, and I will say I really appreciate the fact that Katharine Hepburn is playing this spinster, because she was, most times when we have women who are seen as spinsters, they're like 25 years old, and it's being, cast in a Leonardo DiCaprio light. So you're like, well, I don't think that that's a spinster. Where she was what, in her late 40s, early 50s?
Late 40s, yeah.
During that period. And I think that that is such an interesting thing to allow a woman in her 40s to be able to play, and a single unmarried woman who's not a librarian, because that's also the only other thing that they can do. I will say her accent throughout the film was a little bit distracting, because sometimes she was from the South, sometimes she was from Connecticut, and sometimes she was just from somewhere else. And that kind of threw me off a little bit. But I mean, she's her same charming self in this, and gets to be both a tough Midwestern woman who is having to hold down a family farm of all of these men who can't figure anything out. And while she can understand how the world works around them, she can't figure out her romantic life, and is very afraid and vulnerable there. And I just think that those elements of the film and her performance were so strong, when she kind of was like talking with her family about how she mucked up a potential romance, and the way that they are so sympathetic to her is, I think, rare to see in film in general, and especially more rare in 1956 for men to be concerned about a woman's emotions.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And this is one of the rare nominations from Katharine Hepburn that I hadn't seen before. Mm-hmm. Like I said, it's not one that people typically point to as one of her best, or, more well-known. So this was a first-time watch for me. And another kind of wild movie with a lot of different tones. Mm-hmm. I wasn't exactly sure how I was supposed to feel about the characters themselves, personally. There's kind of a smugness, I think, to the tone of it that I didn't care for, where it feels like we're supposed to be a little bit looking down on most of these characters for being like, Midwestern, and sort of playing into the sort of stereotypical comedy of it. Burt Lancaster is hamming it up like nobody's business once again. Here, I thought it worked a little bit better than what I've been watching lately with him, like Come Back Little Sheba and The Rose Tattoo, where he's just completely in a different movie. But I think because there's more of a comedic quality to this, he was able to blend better with the material. But it's a lot of energy to go up against. And I did hear that Katharine Hepburn really had conflicts with him on set. Mm-hmm. This is their only time working together, and that's probably intentional. She was someone who always studied her lines and came fully prepared. And Burt Lancaster was more of a wing it on the day sort of actor. So those two styles didn't really mesh well. And I think that's part of why I found this to be pretty all over the place, because everyone's doing something a little different in this movie. I mean, I think she's pretty good here. I don't know if this is nomination worthy material, but yeah, I don't know even if she's particularly well cast. Like you said, some of the accent work is all over the place. I don't particularly buy her as a Midwestern person necessarily. She can certainly play these types of characters. She'd done Summertime already and other things in the 50s, but yeah, didn't really feel like she was like this rural Kansas woman per se. She's always sort of read to me as New England, born and bred of a certain stature. And she can play certain like middle class characters well enough. I'm not saying that she has like limited range, but in this case, I think that I sort of struggled to look past this being Katharine Hepburn playing a character rather than just seeing the character itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Because I mean, you are sitting there going like it's Katharine Hepburn with a bunch of men.
A little bit, yeah. Yeah.
I think really the only scene that sticks out where it was like, oh yeah, she was firing on all cylinders was there's a moment with her and Wendell Corey where he comes over to the house, and she gets to be like her normal comedic self.
Yes,
and
yes.
like that scene, I was just like, oh, it felt like a moment of relief, because we are kind of watching people who act in very different ways, who clearly did not communicate before filming started,
right.
to then show up and like try to Frankenstein monster it together. But she and Wendell Corey in that scene, it felt very seamless, with her continually putting her foot in her mouth and him kind of being like rigid and, you know, a big boundary. And that worked really well. And so I think if we had more moments like that, the film wouldn't have felt as uneven.
Right. I would agree with that. I love when she gets to play comedic. I think she was very gifted as a comedian. But I also think, in terms of the vulnerability of the character, you know, she's clearly not pleased with how much her family is pestering her about finding a husband in the beginning. I think she already kind of is reflecting this feeling of like, these men around me have always tried to marry me off in a way. I think they are definitely concerned for her well-being, as you said, and they care about her, obviously, and she cares about them. But there's also this feeling of guilt, like this is something that I've had to deal with for many years. You know, this idea that I can't find another person, a partner. And part of it is just her own self-confidence that's lacking and feeling unlovable. But there's also that feeling of like, this thing is weighing over me, and it has been for so many years. And, you know, the people around me who I love are always kind of wanting the best for me, but I find that I can't fully get there as a person yet. I think that element of it, she keys into really well, and you feel like she's always been a great, like, vulnerable actor for me, and she has this ability to have this well of emotion in her eyes. You see that sort of subtle devastation of, you know, I just went off on a excursion to try to get into a relationship with other people, and it didn't really work out, and I struck out again, and it's like this feeling of being stuck in a rut. You know, I think that she really reflects that well.
Yeah, absolutely. And just kind of like when she's telling her family about how the only person who paid any attention to her was an 8-year-old child, and she plays it off as being like, oh, isn't that funny? But with just her delivery, and as you said, what she's doing with her eyes and her facial expression, it's like literally only someone who is a child looked at me, which, how am I so invisible to others, is heartbreaking.
Yeah, in a way it's strangely complementary with Summertime. I don't know if you've seen Summertime, but it's the same kind of feeling of like, I've been kind of this independent person for so long, and now I'm sort of hoping for that one moment where I can finally feel like I'm evolving as a person. And here it's like this very strange dynamic where she has this connection with Starbuck, and he kind of like is opening her up in some ways. But yeah, I just found them to be sort of complementary in a way.
Yeah, very much so.
I mean, you know, there's a moment where he's manipulating her family into getting her alone with him. She sees right through him, which I love.
Yes.
Because you could tell that a Katharine Hepburn character is not a naive character. It's very rarely as dumb as a lot of her family members are, and sort of buying into this. So they have this sort of argument where she continues to call him out for being fake, and he says that she's not a woman, essentially, and she has this kind of reaction that feels very stinging to me. Like it's that feeling of like, this feeling I've recognized that other people might feel this way about me, and I might feel it about myself to a certain extent, just because of societal expectations that I'm not fully a woman yet because I haven't found that other person. And him very actively saying that to her is just like this really devastating moment for her. you know?
Yeah, because it's kind of after a very weird scene where her father admits that he understands that Starbuck is a con,
Yeah.
while also kind of being like, this sounds like a great deal. And it's like, oh, being conned is not a great deal, so I don't quite understand that. But then when they get alone and he kind of says the quiet parts out loud, and she does all the heavy lifting after that.
Yeah. And then I think one of her brothers even calls her an old maid at one point, which is really another thing that really is sort of triggering for her. And after that, she actually just breaks down and cries to her father and feeling like she might die alone. And she's I like the scene where she's talking about like her skin being all hard. You feel like she's really just vocalizing all these insecurities about herself, and it's all sort of pouring out of her. Really striking scene.
Yes. Yeah. Which is kind of a shame that those scenes feel like pockets of great work in an otherwise kind of messy, sometimes directionless film, which is sad.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. But eventually it is found out that Starbuck is indeed a con artist who's been swindling all these different communities. But it's like, because they've bonded with him, they're not too upset about it because they've kind of known all along. And she even says as much in the end. Like she always knew deep down that he was not actually a Rainmaker. And then ironically, it does end up raining.
Yes.
But he goes off anyway, and she gets to be with the sheriff, and it's, you know, a fine ending. Again, I didn't feel a particularly strong connection with these characters, even to Katharine, to be honest. So by the end, I wasn't particularly blown away by this performance enough to call this nomination worthy. I think this is just like, she elevated some weak material, to be honest.
Yes. Yeah, because I don't know anyone in this film, in front of or behind the camera, that has like been in the Midwest, because it sure didn't feel like anyone considered visiting Kansas to just see what that part of the country is like. So I think that the material itself was just a horrible start, and everyone in it ended up just having to do their best with, you know, being behind the 8 ball.
Right. And it's like I was sort of saying in the beginning, there's this feeling of smugness a little bit to this idea that, you know, people say certain things about like coastal Hollywood writers writing about the Midwest and trying to make these characters feel authentic, but not really doing so, and sort of painting them as these two-dimensional hicks more often than not. That's sort of how this felt to me by the end.
Yes.
And only rarely do you get an actual human being out of this.
Yeah. Unfortunately, so many caricatures of what people assume the Midwest is like.
Yes. But can you think of another actress maybe that could have done this part and been a little bit more authentic in the role?
I mean, not to continually come back to Giant, but like Elizabeth Taylor was really great in her role as a woman who transplants to the South. And so I think that she kind of she understood the changes of regional identity really well. And I think that she's kind of always done that as an actress. I don't know. I just feel like the material from the get-go just sets everyone up for failure. So it's like, who do I want to see work way harder than they have to make this a somewhat better movie? I mean, maybe like a Joanne Woodward too, I think, because she has that method acting from, you know, the 50s that she would be able to kind of slip into that role. But I think that might be about, I don't want to put this bad material on anyone else.
Yeah. Well, it's ironic that you said Giant, because I also think Mercedes McCambridge could have done this.
Oh, that's a good one too.
I mean, she wasn't typically a leading actress per se, but I think this would be a really interesting role for her to take on, because she absolutely could have played that feeling of like being surrounded by men in her life and her having a little bit of toughness, but also some vulnerability there of not fully feeling like a woman. That's kind of a little bit of what her performance in Giant is like to me. So I would like to have seen that.
In another timeline.
All right. So our next nominee here is Nancy Kelly for The Bad Seed. Very excited to finally get the chance to talk about this very, very fun movie. So Nancy Kelly, this is another one and done nomination, but she had a pretty active career in film and in TV and on the stage. Some of her other movies before this were Jesse James, Stanley and Livingstone, One Night in the Tropics. I wouldn't say that she's particularly well known by today's audiences outside of The Bad Seed, but I guess it depends on what film circles you're in there. But she actually played this character on the stage before she reprised this in the film, and she actually won a Tony for it. And then she and pretty much the rest of the cast here reprised their roles for the film, which the film, as you can imagine, did also court quite a bit of controversy. This is still at a time when the production code was looming over Hollywood, so the nature of this material, where we have a murderous child, was a little difficult to accommodate with the censors, but they were able to get away with it for reasons that we will probably talk about later. So The Bad Seed is about a mother named Christine, played by Nancy Kelly, whose husband is very often away, so she does a lot of the raising of their young daughter, Rhoda, played by Patty McCormick. So there's a local boy around Rhoda's age who drowns in the lake, and Christine comes to find out that Rhoda might have had something to do with it, because he had won this medal for penmanship and she wanted it, so she went to some extremes to get it from him. So the rest of the film is just her grappling with the fact that she has a murderous child and whether it might have something to do with her lineage, perhaps. Hence the title, The Bad Seed. So let's talk about it. Thoughts on this movie and Nancy Kelly's performance?
So this movie is wild. I loved it from start to finish. I just think I should say that up front, that this was such a fun time, because it is so much about like nature versus nurture, and like trying to grapple with having a child that you love who is also probably killed one of their classmates. And Nancy Kelly does such an incredible job, because she is playing this very conflicted woman, and she's kind of doing like her own investigation, like trying to figure out like, is my creepy kid with pigtails a murderer, or is she just a little odd? Like, I just need to put the pieces together here. And there are some scenes where Nancy Kelly is with Eileen Heckart, who plays the mother of the deceased child. And she plays those scenes so well, because she has so many suspicions about her own daughter. And yet at the same time, she's also trying to push those away to be present and empathetic towards this grieving woman who is an absolute disaster. And those two, especially when they're in scenes together, are so incredible to watch. But yeah, this film was such a good time. I can't get over how this was made, and that you can enjoy this relatively uncensored, because it's dark. There's a creepy old man in it. There's a murderous child. There are so many dark and twisted elements in this that as we kind of go through the film and it gets darker, and again, Nancy Kelly is having to be this parent who loves her child while also being so suspicious and fearful of her child. I didn't think that, things could get worse, and then they end up getting worse.
Yeah, this is a performance and a film that I've seen before, and I've really gone back and forth on Nancy Kelly's performance. First of all, the film is a blast, like you're saying. I think, maybe it could have been a little shorter. There's probably a few too many scenes that are a little rambly with some of the sort of psychobabble that's happening. But yeah, it's such a fun movie, especially for 1956, really treading into some dark material as much as they can without, angering the censors. But with Nancy, I mean, she's pretty much at an 11 the entire time, very expressive. She's really put through the ringer and is kind of delivering on the heightened emotions that she's going through. And there are a few times where I did feel like she is overstressing everything so much. But at the same time, it sort of fits with the campiness of the film itself and the sort of B-movie feeling of it, that it kind of works for me at the same time. It's kind of an odd one for me to think about because there is such a heightened quality to this entire movie, probably more so than most of the movies and the performances that I've talked about on this show. So part of me is a little bit like thrown off balance when I watch this, but I do love that this is like a full go for broke kind of performance, and she's so committed to making you feel the fear of this woman who is so terrified of her own child. And that just, again, is expanding even further later on in the movie, where we have some of these revelations about her own lineage. So it becomes this, primal sort of fear that she is very much able to express here. I don't think it's a perfect performance, and we might maybe pick at some flaws here, but she kind of matches the tone of the film really well.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I loved about this film is, we're not watching this in 1956, we're watching it now. Mm-hmm. And, I don't think that we have performances where women just kind of get to be all in. Sometimes it's good and bad, but, it feels very reminiscent to Toni Collette in Hereditary, which is an incredible mm-hmm. performance. And there are times where she is just firing on cylinders that we didn't even know that she had before. And so I think for me, as someone who loves sometimes very grand and all-in type performances, the fact that that was not only something that women were able to do in 1956, but they also recognized it, is kind of a big revelation. And I'm slightly jealous of that time period for being like, hey, this is a weird movie. This is dark and twisted, and this woman is internally tormented and has to act her way into showing you that internal torment. And we love that, where nowadays we don't see those types of performances appreciated on an awards scale. So I think that's also kind of why I love this performance so much, even though there are moments where there's a whole part where there's a fire and someone dies in the fire and she absolutely loses her mind. And I'm like, look, yeah, I would also be distraught by this. I don't know if all of those emotions would happen at the same time, though. But you know what? You do you. Yeah. You're living with a little murderer. I don't know what that's like.
Yeah. Who am I to say how I would react in that situation?
But right. Yeah. And I also, one of the things too in the film where there are so many callbacks to earlier material in kind of how they established her relationship with her daughter, that I think that she plays it really well, because it's so often people like to do like a wink, wink, nudge, nudge when it's like, hey, this is a callback from 2 hours ago. And she doesn't play it like that. And so I also greatly appreciate someone who's not performing down to the audience, but just letting it be.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think in the beginning, she's definitely modulating that part of it really well, as you know, having seen this before, I was very intrigued to see how the sort of breadcrumbs would be laid out in the beginning, watching it again, knowing what would happen later. I just love the peppering of little things. Like she says she's not really interested in murder and like things of that nature. And it's really kind of predicting how she's been overlooking a lot of, you know, the issues that Rhoda is having. And she's kind of annoyed by her daughter's behavior in the beginning, but it's not a problem necessarily yet. She still loves her very much. But then, yeah, it's just like this gradual escalation over time. For me, it's hard not to compare it with something like Ellen Burstyn in The Exorcist.
Oh, yeah.
Who's dealing with a rather demonic child of her own. In that case, literally demonic. But I do think, you know, she's able to blend that feeling of wanting to love her daughter, but also having that sense of fear deep down and knowing in her gut that there's something wrong here. And that's also is mirroring in her own feelings that she talks about knowing for a long time that, or like at least sensing deep down that her parents were not her biological parents, and this feeling that she was adopted. She's able to hold these two things at once of honoring her daughter and loving her, but then gradually that sort of gut feeling is getting bigger and bigger, and it's sort of overtaking that feeling of love.
Yeah, because I think that growing feeling culminates in, I mean, towards the end, there is a part where Christine she knows that her daughter's body count is like 3 people at this point. Yeah. And she's like, the only way that she can save other people is by killing her daughter. But she also doesn't want her daughter, in essence, to die alone. So she like reads her a book like she did at the beginning of the film. And she's very nurturing in this very dark moment. And you know, attempts to kill her child and then attempts to kill herself. And Kelly just is able to hold that like darkness that Christine has in herself for even going to this stage and like seeing this as the only way out, while also being like a parent that's like, I love you so much, I'm not going to make you do this by yourself. Like, we're not going to do that alone. And it's a very jarring scene, but like incredibly well acted.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that is for me the highlight from her performance, that scene of her really deciding what's best basically for the benefit of humanity, more or less, because she knows that she's just going to go on and terrorize even more people as she gets older, and that there's something genetic in her that is making her act out in this way. So she's like, I'm just going to put an end to it. I'm just going to put an end to this whole family lineage, including myself. Yeah, reading the bedtime story, there's just that mix of emotions that we see just on her face. And all she's doing is reading from this book. But, you know, at the same time, she hates that she's doing this. She hates that it had to come to this. But she's convinced herself that this is what's right in the end. And then, yeah, as we see, she intends to end her own life as well. So she's clearly in a very bad place. And that's where you really feel the sort of dark tragedy of her circumstances.
Yes.
And in that respect, it becomes a very haunting kind of performance.
Especially because, as you noted, like early on, she's talking about how she doesn't like murder and dark things. Like, you know, her whole concern is that she has somehow passed on this dark lineage to her daughter, while she herself does not inhibit and, you know, like have any type of tendencies that are aiming to harm other people. And so when she's confronted with that, it just becomes so interesting that she almost kind of decides that in order to help the situation, that she has to somehow live out this self-fulfilling prophecy that she has. And it's so, like, it's doubly tragic because, you know, she's not a character up until this point that has been violent or, again, wishing harm on others, and yet she feels that this is the only thing that she can resort to, and it's her losing herself that's also tragic in that moment.
Exactly. And we can definitely talk about just her reaction to learning about her past and confirming her feelings that she was, in fact, adopted, and learning that she is the descendant of, or her, I think it's her mother was a serial killer.
Yeah. Her mother, like, killed her whole family, and she is, like, the only one who survived.
Yeah. So it's a very unsettling backstory that she's now having to just learn all at the same time. And I think that part of it, you know, like I was sort of saying, she's at 11 for a lot of the movie, but when we get to these more dramatic revelations, I think she's so in the pocket of where she needs to be, of just being like, my whole entire world has been rocked, essentially.
Yeah, so absolutely.
Some of the quieter moments from her, I think, are kind of strangely compelling, like when she's sort of lost in her own mind. I think that's at the part where, like, Rhoda is just asking to go see the ice cream man because, you know, the truck is outside. I like those moments of her really having to process what's happening and how traumatic this is for her. It's surprisingly affecting.
Yeah.
Like, you know, before this rewatch, I had a certain feeling about this performance of being a little bit too hysterical in certain ways, of just like always being in that one frequency. But watching it again, you see some of the connective tissue, you know, that's connecting all of these different bigger moments from her, that it's surprisingly a more well-rounded performance than I remember it being.
Yeah.
So
yeah, very much so.
So then, of course, we can talk a little bit about the ending if you want, which was reversed from the play itself because of the censors and how the production code always wanted evil to pay. And evil does indeed pay. Earlier in the film, just to set up the ending, Christine finds the medal that Rhoda stole from the boy who drowned. And Christine goes off to just throw it into the river just to basically hide the evidence.
Mm-hmm.
And then Rhoda goes off at night, even though it's like lightning and rain pouring down. She just decides, I have to go get that medal now. And what happens to her?
She gets struck by lightning, which...
Yes.
I find it so funny that the censors are like, evil cannot prevail, so you must kill this child in order for it to pass code. That just seems like the mental gymnastics on that one were astounding.
A lot of work was put into justifying that, I would say.
Because I think it is so interesting that, because, you know, the play ends where Christine does complete suicide, and that action then alerts neighbors to find Rhoda and save her. And, you know, that's a dark enough ending. But in order to pass code, they were like, nope, take that little blonde kid out into a thunderstorm and kill her for us. Thank you.
Then we will be pleased.
Yeah, I just...
Yes.
Do I also love Nancy Kelly yelling, Rhoda? Like, at the end, yes. I think that's an iconic moment. So I will give the censors that. But, I do find it really funny.
Yes. And I love that it literally just ends with that striking lightning and the end.
Yeah.
Like, that there's no, like, aftermath of Christine finding out about any of this. That's it.
Yeah, they're just like...
Because Christine does end up surviving.
Yes.
But...
Yeah.
And then we have a lovely curtain call.
Yeah.
Which we don't often see.
It's one of the more jarring endings of a film that I've watched, not just for this, but just as of late. And I think it does kind of vamp up that kind of campiness to it. So I appreciate that. I appreciate that we were camp from start to finish.
And I think the reason that they did that curtain call is because they felt like, well, maybe we shouldn't just end with, you know, lightning striking a child and falling into the water and just being like, okay, I guess we'll leave the theater now. Okay. Yeah, sort of leave them out on a little bit of a high, I suppose.
Yeah, give them a cool down from that moment before they exit the theater.
So, I mean, I do think it is worth noting that a performance like this absolutely would not get a nomination in modern times, which is a shame because, like you're saying, comparing it to Toni Collette, like, if Toni Collette for Hereditary can't get a nomination, then I don't think this would have in a modern time. Yeah. So nominate more horror performances is all I'm saying.
Please, because they are so fun and women get to do so much more in horror than a majority of other genres. So
yeah, that's a very, very good point. And so I don't know. I would hope that with the changing Academy demographics that some of that might change, but who knows?
Yeah, time will tell.
Well, let's get to our final losing nominee here. We're here at Deborah Kerr once again. Deborah Kerr for The King and I. So this is her third Oscar nomination, third loss. But once again, she is in a big film nominated for Best Picture. This was a big production, another one that's based on a stage show. This was not a part, though, that was always hers from the beginning. Apparently, Maureen O'Hara was almost cast, but they opted for Deborah Kerr as sort of, feeling like she had a level of refinement and elegance to her, even though she didn't have the kind of singing voice to carry a musical like this. So much like we saw with Natalie Wood and with Audrey Hepburn, her singing vocals in this film were dubbed by Marni Nixon. So the two of them, I guess, worked very extensively together to just match each other as much as possible. And Marni even sang in a lower register to match with Deborah's speaking voice. And then Deborah also took singing lessons to be like as accurate as possible with the lip syncing. So that was that. And The King and I, it's based on the real life story of Anna Leowens, who is a British school teacher, a widow, who goes to Siam to be the governess for the king and his many children, 15 children. So there's kind of some culture shock in both of those directions. And the king has certain traditional values that don't really jibe with hers, and she makes that very well known and asserts herself. And then over time, they come to sort of respect each other and create a weird little relationship that isn't quite romance, but it's like a pretty deep connection, I would say. So let's talk Deborah Kerr. Would love to know your thoughts on Deborah and her performance here in The King and I.
Yeah, so before we started, I had mentioned that The King and I was a musical that was on rotation in my household as a child. There are so many musicals where Marni Nixon comes in to save the day.
Yeah.
And I think that the work that she and Deborah Kerr did in this film is impeccable because it is so hard to lip sync, especially if you are not like a trained singer, because there's breath control. There is, the way that sometimes you're singing in your head. Sometimes you're singing more from your diaphragm, and that changes the way that you hold yourself. And I think that Deborah Kerr nailed it in that aspect. Like, she just really sold that this was her voice and her existing in this world. So I really appreciate that from her. I loved the scene Getting to Know You. It's one of my favorite songs from this musical. It's a very difficult thing to be a non-singer in a musical, and Deborah Kerr at least put in some work to make it as believable as possible. And that just, to me, is something that should be highlighted and celebrated in a time when dubbing was so common.
Yeah, I would say that she makes it look pretty easy, even though it's very difficult. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm obviously a fan of Deborah Kerr, as I've talked about before. She just has a kind of versatility that I often find pretty compelling, especially when the character is meaty enough for her to really dig into it. I don't think there's a whole lot of opportunities for her to completely dig into the role as much here, but she's very watchable. I think her lip syncing is so on point here. She also just has like a feistiness to her and just this energy that is strong-willed, and I think it's perfect for this character of Anna. But she also has that feeling of like nobility in a way, and that sort of stiff upper lip quality. You know, she's using her natural accent this time, unlike the first two nominations I've talked about her with, where she's playing Americans. And it feels really comfortable for her. And she operates in this way that is like, she's clearly the entry point into the film, and we're seeing so much of it from her perspective, and you feel like you're in safe hands with her in a way. And I think in many ways it does preclude Julie Andrews' performance in The Sound of Music, which is a similar type of character, but has that sort of nurturing quality mixed with that feeling that this person has these strong convictions at the same time, and she will let those convictions be known when she feels that it's appropriate to.
Yes, because I mean, the first song that opens the film is her and her son. You know, she is talking about fear and vulnerability and how it's like you can feel those things, but you have to carry on through them, like very much the keep calm and carry on British attitude. But she does it in such like a lovely way, instead of a, you know, rub some dirt in it and get over it type of thing. Like, she is very much a woman of conviction, while also like validating things about others that might be different from her, or learning to hold both fear and courage at the same time. And I think that, yeah, she just seems so effortless in this film, when you know that there's so much work going into it. She has these dance numbers. She's in the biggest dress I have ever seen that someone has had to dance in. And
True.
She looks like she is having such a good time, while also being so strong in other moments where they're talking about morality. They're talking about, you know, at one point there's a discussion on slavery, and she discusses how much she admires Abraham Lincoln and his fight for dismantling slavery in the United States. And now she's in a country where there are people who are enslaved. And for a film that does suffer from Hollywood racism of the 1950s, and obviously before and after, there are some hints of people trying to understand and reconcile race and imperialism and their place in the world. And I think that that's pretty revolutionary for a musical.
Yeah, I agree. And what I do actually really love is her stressing really the importance of having her own house.
Yes.
Which I think is very thematically relevant to exactly what you're talking about, this feeling that she can feel free to be independent and have her own things and not have to be living in the king's palace, even though he's making her, you know, she's basically forced to do that. She is this kind of independent woman who knows what she wants. And I think we've been talking a lot just among these nominees about the idea of women really having to navigate in a predominantly male environment, you know, certainly with Baby Doll and with the Rainmaker. I think here is where we're seeing more of a nuanced type of performance and character of her trying to balance both having those convictions and then still having to adapt to her situation, and basically making the best of a not ideal situation, you know, sort of doing the best she can and really adapting on the fly. And I think that really speaks to Deborah's performance, where she makes that feel pretty effortless, like we've been saying. So
yeah, because I mean, not only is she like fighting for her own home, kind of fighting for, I mean, she is in essence kind of changing the perspective of the palace, because she's coming in with a British mindset on education. But going back to Getting to Know You, there is kind of that interest in not only being a teacher, but being a student of life at the same time. And she kind of makes so many subtle choices that show that while she is a woman of strong conviction, she's also not opposed to taking a step back and learning a little bit about how the world is different around her. And I find that to be a really moving part of her performance.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sort of in this category full of characters that are having to deal with a lot of weakness and just are in these bad circumstances, I think this feels like the kind of likable, quote unquote, role model type of character among this mix that in some ways it's a little bit of a surprise to me that she didn't end up winning, because she's so watchable and so winning in this part and making you feel comforted in her presence, even if she's dealing with these difficult subject matters. And getting to certain points where she just becomes fed up after a while and saying, I'm most certainly not your servant. You know, those more defiant moments I think she really earns because of the subtlety that she puts into gradually showing that growing frustration that she wants to be able to teach these children, but he keeps kind of like doing these things and like barging into her classroom sometimes and, you know, getting mad that she's teaching this singing lesson about like home sweet house, you know, things like that. So you have, you know, those scenes like that, but then you have these more delicate and well modulated scenes like when he's really anxious about sort of being taken over by other countries and he's sort of asking her to guess what his response would be to such a takeover, and is basically making her do all the heavy lifting and sort of like asking for advice from her sort of indirectly. I love how we just see her just like very subtly manipulating him into saying like, maybe you should host this sort of friendship tour, and him kind of being like, and sort of just like trying to see what else she has to say, because he clearly is starting to value her opinion more. Just those little subtle changes in her face where she recognizes that, oh, now he's asking me for advice. I like that dynamic.
Yeah, because there's not a romance in the film, which I also really appreciate, because she's a widow. She lost her husband, is now here with her young son. And I think that they find a camaraderie in one another that I don't think that she had back home, because, you know, we see when, who was it, the ambassador who kind of shows up and brings an associate who happened to know her and still had harbored feelings for her. And I think the fact that the king values her for her mind and her opinion and the way that she processes the world, versus where other men just look at her as, you would make a very great wife because you have these things, but he sees her as this whole person. And I really appreciate that dynamic in the film as well.
Yeah. And just speaking to that sort of soiree thing that happens where the men are being invited there, I think there's just like this subtle change in her performance where she's sort of reflecting a certain kind of genteel quality there, when I think this guy who admires her clearly, he's there, and she sort of steps into a certain kind of role that she wasn't necessarily, you know, expressing herself in that way before this, and sort of giving that more dignified, stiff upper lip type of performance for the other men. I think that's another really subtle change in her performance that is really fun. And then, you know, whenever the king is sort of having his missteps during the big soiree, she has like these knowing looks of being like, oh geez, things are not going well. And then the shall we dance sequence, I think, is really lovely. You know, it's talking about the thrill of getting into a relationship with people and like courtship, and them dancing together in the ballroom is really beautiful. And it's like all one take, I think, from what I recall. So there's no hiding, there's no stunt doubles there. That's really her. Again, I just keep coming back to the idea that she just makes it look so easy. And that might be why she never won.
Yeah.
Is that Yeah.
Yeah, she's ballroom dancing again in some of the biggest gowns I have ever seen, and just does it with such conviction and ease that it's like, I don't think anyone else would be able to do that. I know she makes it look like it's not a hard task, but that has to be so difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, by the end, we get this very emotional development where the king is dying and she's reading his final letter to her. And I love, she's always been so good at this trying to keep it together feeling, but also being very broken up inside. And you hear like the cry in her voice, that wavering in her voice is always so heartbreaking for me. And her suggesting like, you two could have been such good friends, you know, things like that. And saying she likes him very much indeed. You know, just that storm of emotion that's happening within her, but still keeping it composed and keeping it together. So yeah, she ends the film strong. I think just the overall takeaway I get from this is that it's a really interesting character, but in another actress's hands, it might not be as interesting and as nuanced as what Deborah's able to bring to it.
Oh, yeah.
And really bring out this character in a way that is equal to the king and what Yul Brynner is bringing, which is much more showy and overt in his performance. And the two of them are so equally matched that, again, I don't know if many other actresses could match him in such different energies too, but still making it work.
Yeah, very much so. And like, even just like the subtle moments where, you know, there's that scene where he goes and ushers everyone to go pray to Buddha, and he keeps playing with her because they have a conversation that in order for her to show respect to him, her head must be lower than his. And so he keeps changing his head level over and over. And just the looks on her face that she's giving throughout it, where she knows she's being messed with, but she's also going to mess with him back. Just those tiny moments in this film really tie those bigger moments together.
Exactly. Yeah. And this is something that I've been talking about a little bit over the years that I've talked about 50s especially, but this idea that some performances get nominated because of the type of character they're playing. If they're playing a real person, there's kind of just that natural feeling of like, oh, this is a Beatty character, they're probably going to get nominated. And then there's other types of performances where I think they really do earn the nomination specifically because of what the actress is bringing to the role. And for me, this is where I think Deborah falls into the latter camp, even though in some level it is Beatty in the fact that it's like this big grand musical and everything based on real events. There's something extra that I think she brings to it without being super overtly showy about it at the same time, that I always think is a great thing to recognize within the Academy, because it's not that the character is super well written and therefore they're getting this nomination, or that they're naturally a compelling subject. It's like she's bringing this character to life in a way that feels effortless. Anyway, that's my spiel on that. I don't know if you agree.
Oh, because I think, so 1956 also had Carousel, which is another Rodgers and Hammerstein, which is a disaster of a film. But that, I think you could, if that had been nominated for anything, would have felt very Oscar bait-y, because it is just kind of let's formulaically put these things together to make this movie musical, where I think Deborah Kerr put in so much work, and it is so evident upon like rewatch, again, now as an adult rewatching it, because as a kid, I'm sitting there going like, this is magical. And as an adult, I have that same feeling. And as an adult now, I can't appreciate the work that went into it, because if I felt that magic 25 years ago and I'm feeling that same thing now, that means that she did something truly special with her performance.
I think that's a lovely final note to end on as we transition into our big winner. Ingrid Bergman for Anastasia, or Anastasia, depending on your pronunciation. There's a lot to talk about with what led up to this performance and this Oscar win. So we last talked about Ingrid Bergman for her performance in Joan of Arc back in 1948. And then pretty shortly after that, she sees Rome Open City, which is directed by Roberto Rossellini, and she becomes entranced with that and wanted to work with him. But he was an Italian director, so she essentially leaves Hollywood in the late 40s to work with him on 3 films, Stromboli, Europa 51, and Journey to Italy. And even before that, she falls in love with Rossellini, and they have an affair, even though both of them were married at that time. So there was a huge scandal in America, considering she was, one of the more beloved stars. And here she was essentially like sullying her public image. That was very much the feeling at the time. So she makes those films, she stays away from Hollywood, and then she separates from Rossellini around mid-50s, and then she's sort of courted back to Hollywood here with Anastasia. And it's a real comeback narrative, one of the first, I think, that we're talking about here in Best Actress, where she wins partly because of the narrative of her being away for so long. Mm-hmm. So we'll definitely get into that a little later on. But Anastasia, it's based on a stage play, and it tells the story of a woman named Anna, played by Ingrid Bergman, who is found on the streets of Paris by these men who think that she might be the long-lost Grand Duchess Anastasia, whose family was executed in 1918 during the Russian Revolution. So there's this guy, Bunin, played by Yul Brynner, once again showing up here. And he's this former general who is now this nightclub owner, and he's hoping to prove her to be the real Anastasia and hoping to get some money out of the whole situation, basically. So she goes through a bit of a My Fair Lady Pygmalion type of transformation, and she's presented to the Dowager Empress, played by Helen Hayes, former Best Actress winner herself, to see if she is indeed the real one. So that's more or less the story. There's also some romance subplots here, but those aren't really as interesting, I think, as the main story necessarily. But would love to know your thoughts here on Ingrid Bergman as a performer, whether you've sort of seen her in a lot of her other films like Gaslight, her other Best Actress win, and what you think of this winning performance here.
Yeah, so Ingrid Bergman is kind of a name in my household because Casablanca, I think, is one of my dad's favorite movies. And so from a very young age was watching that and not understanding its importance until much later in life. I think one of the things about her is that she just has like a screen presence that, quiet or not, like she just owns every moment that she's in. And I think, in early film, you're getting a lot of stage actresses going into film work, and while the acting part is the same, the presence is very different. And I think that Ingrid Bergman's kind of one of the staples in my mind as like, if you want to do proper screen presence, like do what Ingrid Bergman was doing, because she's very present in everything. I actually recently watched Gaslit for the first time, and she has to do so much with very little dialogue in this noir horror film of a woman who's being tormented by her husband. And I think that her ability to, without words, add so much to her character, then you can see in this film where she's playing a very confused and lost woman who doesn't know her identity, who's being told that she is so many different things that she doesn't understand whether or not those are true. And her frustration in both being told who she is and her frustration in not knowing anything about herself. I think she folds those two things in very seamlessly. And so as someone who grew up with the 90s animated version of Anastasia,
yes,
I will say I did miss Journey to the Past in this film. However, I think Ingrid Bergman's performance does make up for that. Because she's just so enchanting, and it doesn't matter if she's, you know, in a Hitchcock film or a Ingmar Bergman film. Like, she just knows how to captivate you from the moment she's on screen.
Yeah. I mean, I think this performance is pretty good. You know, it's Ingrid Bergman. Yeah. I love her. I think she has such an evocative presence on screen that definitely, as you're saying, can just be really captivating. And I think on paper, this is a compelling character where she could play with this sense of duality, essentially. This feeling of like, who am I? Am I the person that people say I am? Can I go back to who I was before? If I really was that person. Like, there's a lot from a character perspective that was probably very appealing for Ingrid, and especially to make this her big comeback role in Hollywood. And I think it's actually kind of meta on that level too. The idea of us not being exactly sure who this person is actually something that Ingrid herself was directly going through in just, you know, the media in America. So on that level, I sort of find the narrative of this performance to be probably one of the juiciest ones that we've had in Best Actress so far. But then in terms of execution, I think the film is pretty lacking in a lot of ways. And I don't necessarily think her performance is lacking, but it's not really up to the high standard that she had set previously, I would say. And there is a certain element of her elevating the material, but not really enough for me to justify this win sort of in a vacuum.
No, like, yes, I love Ingrid Bergman. I think that she's great, but there are moments in this film where it just kind of feels like she's cakewalking it a little bit of like, I've been doing this for years. And the film also, what is the runtime of this? It's 105 minutes. So this is under 2 hours. And it still probably felt like the longest film that I watched for this year. So, I mean, and I think part of it is, I don't know if they were understanding like sensationalized stories for this year, because there's a lot of scandal that comes with the story of Anastasia and the lore of who she was. And this is within a generation of that, of, you know, Anastasia's family being murdered. This is, you know, there are feasibly people who were alive during that revolution. And the fact that it doesn't really reflect the nuances of that in the script, I think is where everything kind of starts to fall apart, because they boil it down to, is she or isn't she? Is there maybe a little bit of a romance and these people want to make money, without looking at the historical context and the societal impacts that having a Romanov royal actually be alive, what that would mean. I think that that's where the story lacks. And again, we don't have bops to kind of propel that narrative in this film. So as a film overall, it was a bit of a snooze.
Yes, I would agree with that. And I think the perspective of it just feels a little strange to me overall. I did read a review on Letterboxd from my great friend Christoph. I want to just highlight what he said, which I think would actually make for a very compelling film, which is that, what do you think of the idea of telling this story from the perspective of the Helen Hayes character, of the Dowager Empress, and her having to come to grips with the idea that Anastasia might still be out there and it might actually be this woman, and she's had to also deal with all these other imposters, you know, leading up to that. And there is a little bit of that more mystery to what Ingrid Bergman would be delivering.
Yes.
I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, again, not to continually go back to the animated masterpiece, Anastasia, but yes. I think that the film kind of frames it where we are considering the Grand Duchess's perspective in that journey, because she starts off with the voiceover. We bookend the film with her meeting Anastasia and determining that's her granddaughter. And that kind of helps people understand that historical significance of, again, we're talking about very fancy royal people, and lineage and family name is of extreme importance, not just the relationship that they have with one another as a grandparent to a grandchild, but also looking at royal lineage. And so I think that this film, if it had been told from, the Empress's perspective, or had been at least had that perspective bookend the film, that we would have had a much more nuanced performance from everyone, because Ingrid Bergman was not the only one who was I know how to cry on cue. Everyone felt like they were there for a paycheck.
Yes. I think, actually, speaking to the idea of the Dowager Empress being a compelling part of this story, I think the scenes that the two of them share together are, for me, when the film really comes alive, where we have this feeling of her kind of being disappointed by her grandmother and her coldness towards her at the beginning, and sort of dismissing her and feeling like she's been through this all before. She doesn't even want to believe at this point that this might be her granddaughter. She's just kind of done with it all. And then we obviously eventually get that moment of connection when her grandmother remembers that she coughed whenever she was frightened, which I think is really striking. And the two of them both just firing on all cylinders of that mutual recognition that they have in each other. I think that's such a beautiful moment. And I love, obviously, that the groundwork is laid with her coughing so much throughout the film. And to get that emotional payoff is one of the better elements of, again, as you're saying, to use your word, a rather snoozy kind of film.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that might be the only scene that sticks out in my mind. And I did watch this.
Right. Yeah, it's just, again, to go back to it, it's like a story that is inherently compelling. There's a reason that this story has been told so many different times in all these different versions of media. But I don't know if this really lives up to the drama of that very much. It just sort of lays there in a way. And I wish that it was more interesting, and I wish Ingrid Bergman had the opportunity to do more interesting things. I mean, she definitely has a kind of weariness in the beginning and just a heaviness that suits what this character has been through. She's had to have this rough upbringing, and she's, lower class, and she hasn't had that grand childhood, and she carries that really well. And the character just doesn't really come to life for me, unfortunately. And I don't know if I necessarily blame Ingrid for that so much as the script.
Yeah.
Either way, it's not a great match overall. I don't know if I would cast someone else in it, because this character just makes a lot of sense to be played by Ingrid Bergman at this time in Hollywood. But I just feel like there's a spark missing here, that something sort of got lost in translation.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And it feels like her personal life bleeding into the film is kind of what made it so much more recognizable, because I don't think that had there not been that controversy, that people would have been like, it's a fine performance. I don't know if she would have been nominated, let alone win for it.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good way of naturally talking about this Oscar race and why she did win that Oscar. Just to speak to any precursor stuff, it was a little all over the place, and she didn't even attend the ceremony. But I think, to a certain respect, there could have been a bit of a race here. We had people like Carroll Baker and Baby Doll in a kind of performance that was rewarded quite often in the sort of play to film adaptation types of things were very big in the 50s. we talked about Judy Holliday, Vivian Leigh, Shirley Booth, Anna Magnani. Like, the type of performance that Carroll Baker gives is sort of in keeping with that in the 50s. And then you had Deborah Kerr in a big splashy musical that's nominated for Best Picture, that Yul Brynner's winning Best Actor. That certainly has a strong narrative in and of itself. I don't know if the other two, Nancy Kelly and Katharine Hepburn, were necessarily as much in it, but do you think there are reasons outside of what the narrative was for Ingrid Bergman that she ended up winning this?
I mean, I think there's the narrative, but also the comeback. Because I think, when you look later on with like Mickey Rourke or Robert Downey Jr. and like the way that, I mean, I'm mentioning men because we love to give men a comeback more often than we love to give women a comeback.
Very true.
But, they do love that like redemption arc. And it doesn't have to be in the film itself. Like, they love when people kind of come back to the structure of Hollywood and people that vie for awards. So I think that also played a huge role in her winning, because she was kind of leaving that relationship that she left Hollywood for and was coming back, I guess, to what people expected of her.
And I think the fact that she was so beloved before the scandal, I think, was a big part of people just sort of wanted to welcome her back. They wanted to love her again, essentially. And this was a good excuse to do that, because I think when you look at the performance outside of just the character itself, I don't think of it necessarily as a huge acting feat necessarily to the kind of performance that tends to win an Oscar. So on that level, again, it's sort of like in a vacuum when you don't even know the full story of why this happened, then it sort of becomes like a questionable win, I would say. All due respect to her.
Yes. Yeah. Like, when you look at some of the other performances that she's nominated for or had won for, it's very questionable why they would have, one, seen this as an award-worthy performance, and then two, actually given her the award at the end of the night.
Right. So we'll talk later on about who we think might have been the runner-up here. I think there's a few different possibilities, but I would guess that just based on what I've been reading, that Ingrid Bergman was more or less seen as a done deal by the media going into it, that she had this very juicy narrative come back, that despite that, I think there could have been some contending. So we'll talk about that later on. But first, we got to do some Twitter questions. Are we ready?
Let's do it.
All right. This is from Dante Fichetti, who said, serious question. Did Helen Hayes' talk with Ingrid only force me to break down in tears? That was melodramatic, but still somehow heartbreaking. I wasn't necessarily in tears per se, but I think it is by far the most moving part of the film.
Yes. Yeah. I don't know if any of that movie would bring me to tears, but it was the moment where you finally get to see two actors do their thing. And so, yes, right. I would agree with that.
Baby Clyde said, seeing as she's such a good actress, why are all of Ingrid Bergman's wins so bad? I disagree with the idea that Gaslight is a bad win. First of all, I think Anastasia is a mediocre win, to be honest. But I would say that Murder on the Orient Express win is pretty bad. I think in both of those, the 2 and 3 wins for her, I think there was more narrative than performance behind the win. But yeah, I mean, I agree with the sentiment that she has much better performances in her career, including, as you alluded to, Autumn Sonata.
Yes. I think that's kind of the thing that happens with nominations and wins in general is, that, just to throw out a name, that one day Carey Mulligan is going to win an Oscar for probably a very middle of the road performance and film. And everyone's going to secretly say that she won it for wildlife because that was the performance that should have won. I just think it's a tale as old as time that the wins might not be as strong as the nominations or the should have beens.
That's very true. Yeah. Gordon said, where does Bergman's performance here rank among the second-time winners you've covered so far? Which is Louise Reiner, Bette Davis, Olivia de Havilland, and Vivien Leigh. I mean, taken as a whole, I think Vivien Leigh is obviously number one with a bullet, like 2 unimpeachable wins there. Then I would say, you know, Olivia de Havilland has 2 very good to great wins there. Bette Davis, I probably would have given her Oscars for other films, to be honest. And then Ingrid Bergman, 1 out of 2 ain't bad there. And then, sorry to my listener Fritz, but Louise Reiner would definitely be last because of The Good Earth. Do you have any thoughts on these 2-time winners here?
I mean, I think that you ranked it the same way that I would have ranked it.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, you can't... Everyone else falls behind Vivien Leigh. So that's just kind of a done deal.
Correct.
Yeah. And so, I mean, Anastasia's not strong, and we know that.
And speaking of Fritz, here's a question from Fritz. Helen Hayes was apparently campaigned in lead and got a lead nomination at the Golden Globes. If she had been in supporting, could she have won? I think so. I think she could have won. I think it's a classic sort of supporting turn performance, a little bit of a comeback for her, too. What do you think?
I'm pulling up who won that year. Yeah.
I believe this is Dorothy Malone for Written on the Wind.
It is. It is. Yeah. And I think that given that, I mean, we have so many nominations in here that I also like with, you know, Mercedes McCambridge and Giant and both Eileen Heckart and Patty McCormick for The Bad Seed, that even though those are great performances, I do think because of her previous wins and just familiarity with the Academy, that if she had been in supporting, she would have just dominated the award season.
Probably. But I think there was this feeling at the time, which we've talked about a lot, that if you are already a star, you did not go supporting, regardless of the screen time that you had. So there you go. And then Fritz also asked, if Gertrude Lawrence had not died, do you think she would have replaced her role like Yul Brynner, or would Hollywood reject her? So this is about The King and I.
I think that's really difficult because Deborah Kerr has already had so many nominations up until this point that depending on the casting process, I don't know. Because if it was just a direct from stage to film, then I think that's a no-brainer that she would have been cast. But if there was campaigning and auditioning involved, I could see Deborah Kerr being a strong contender still, because she does come with a lot of clout already due to her previous performances and nominations.
Yeah. I think I would agree there. I think Deborah Kerr's reputation at that time as a movie star, you know, would have just carried the day there. I don't think they would have cast 2 Broadway people in the lead roles. So this is from Jeffrey Kerr, who said, Anna in The King and I managed to win Tonys for Gertrude Lawrence, Donna Murphy, and Kelly O'Hara, yet it couldn't win Deborah Kerr an Oscar. What gives?
That's a great question, because indeed, what gives?
I think Deborah Kerr was just destined to be an Oscar bridesmaid, which is really sad. Maybe she just wasn't as apparent in her acting choices that voters typically fall for. I'll say that to be diplomatic.
It's a great diplomatic answer.
Yes. So I don't know. I think in this case, I think probably it's just Ingrid Bergman and her narrative got in the way of what was rightfully hers.
100%.
So, yeah. And then Christoph N. and John T. both asked, is this her best shot? Is Deborah Kerr, was this her best shot of winning the Oscar? I'm not going to say yes for sure until we get to her final nomination, but for now, up to this point, I'll say probably yes. You know, Best Picture nominee, Best Actor win for this movie, so yeah.
And it was a big production, just
right.
Everything involved.
And Emily said, maybe talk about how because Deborah Kerr knew she was getting dubbed at certain points and was able to work with Marni Nixon, this maybe helped lead to her getting a nomination over other famous dubbings that didn't. So I think that's obviously referencing Natalie Wood and Audrey Hepburn. I think it's a fair point. I think the fact that the two of them could work so closely together definitely created this kind of symbiosis in a way that made the performance come alive just from the two of them.
Yeah, I think, as we said, lip syncing in a musical is so difficult. And I think Deborah Kerr, if you want to do that in a musical, do what Deborah Kerr was doing, because it just seemed so natural, even knowing that Marni Nixon was doing the singing. So
it feels like Marni Nixon should get like an asterisk, like also a nomination for this.
She needed many awards, because that woman saved a number of musicals.
She really did. For some Katharine Hepburn questions, this is from Cody Derricks and Christoph, who both asked, is this Katharine Hepburn's worst nomination or your least favorite nomination from her? Not my least favorite, and I don't think it's her worst, but I do think it is bottom tier compared to all of the great other nominations she has.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah.
Cinema Sex Kitten says, is this the first Hepburn nomination purely because of the respect from the industry? The first, well, we have to nominate her, it's Kate. Or do you think that was Summertime? I don't think it was Summertime. Part of me does want to say that, yes, this feels like the first time for me where the Academy just sort of got into a rhythm of nominating her. Mm-hmm. Because it's easy to forget that she wasn't always an Academy favorite per se. Like, she was nominated very sporadically in the 30s and the 40s, and yes, obviously she won, but she was passed over a lot of times before she got on this hot streak in the 50s. So I think around this time is the start of them being like, oh, we really, really like her, and we should probably just keep nominating her even though she'll never show up to our show.
Yeah, because I mean, the accent alone would tell you that I think they saw her name and said, yeah, that's who I pick.
Eric Maxwell Brunn said, do you find it odd that Hollywood kept trying to make us believe that Katharine Hepburn would be a spinster?
I think because of her very complicated relationship with Spencer Tracy, that I think that she has a very empathetic way of understanding women who are not in conventional relationships or in a relationship at all, at least publicly, kind of. So I think, to me, I understand that she's elegant and a catch, but I think that because of her own complicated personal life, that she can really understand people that don't fit into a conventional romantic narrative, and she does a really great job at doing that. So I get that she's beautiful, but I think as an actress she understands people much better than someone else would have in the same performance.
Yeah, and she has a kind of temperament and a sort of attitude that suggests independence, and I think that can naturally transfer into being seen as a spinster, quote unquote.
Yes.
For Nancy Kelly, let's see. Baby Clyde said, does Nancy Kelly give the worst nominated performance ever in this category?
No. Period.
No. She doesn't even give the worst performance in this lineup. That's my hot take.
No. I 100% agree with that.
Yeah. I do know that there are some critics of this performance, which, again, it's a lot. It's a lot of performance, so I get it. But no, I think she brought, weirdly, the right kind of energy to that role. This is from our friend Chels. Hi, Chels. How bad is the bad seed?
I mean, so the little girl in the film, her character is very bad. She has a high body count.
Yeah.
The film as a whole, I love. I love it. It's weird and dark and twisted, and I don't think that we would have weird and dark and twisted like Ari Aster type films if we didn't have the bad seed.
There you go. It's it's a open for interpretation question, because how bad is the movie or how bad is the bad seed in the bad seed? Because clearly it's a pretty bad seed that has caused generational trauma at this point. So not
so
great. The movie, I don't think is bad at all. Could be better, maybe. Could be tightened up a little, but I've definitely seen worse on this show, let me tell you. Andrew Carden said, is Patty McCormack truly lead or supporting? And would she have made the cut with a lead campaign?
I mean, if we're going based off of the formula of the 50s, then she's supposed to be supporting. She's a child actor.
Right.
She's nominated with a character actress in the same film. Lead, she might be the central character, but that doesn't mean that you are the protagonist or focus of the film. So I think that that's murky if you think that the titular role should be the lead character. So I think
I really had to think about this, because to me, this isn't a clear-cut case of a child actor being frauded into supporting. Because I kind of think she is supporting, because so much of the film is from Nancy Kelly's perspective, you know? But she's also like the driving force for so much of the film. So my gut instinct is to tentatively say that she's in the right category.
Yeah.
Sebastian Gronbach said, who would win in a battle between the bad seed, Damien from The Omen, and the orphan?
I mean, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
Mainly because Isabel Fuhrman's also a great actress and played that character so creepily. So I don't know. I think I'd still give it to Patty McCormack though, because there's just something very nefarious about a cute child who burns a man to death. I don't know.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, Damien is literally the Antichrist, so there's that. I think he probably wins most of those battles, but in a weird way, you know what? I could see Rhoda really sneaking her way out of some situations. She just has to avoid lightning, I suppose, because that's her downfall.
Yep, no inclement weather. She's great otherwise.
Exactly. Let's see. Cinema Sex Kitten said, 1956 was the Broadway debut of My Fair Lady. Which of these women would you have cast in the role of Eliza Doolittle on stage if given the chance?
I don't know if any of them can sing.
That was my first thing. Is like, depends on who can sing. I think Katharine Hepburn, probably not her.
No.
Carroll Baker is probably too young-ish. I'm not sure she could really, like, belt in a way that's necessary for that part. Probably not Nancy Kelly. I guess Deborah Kerr could pull it off, maybe with some good vocal lessons, right?
Yeah, I think that might be the only one. Or we can have a Singing in the Rain type situation where Marnie Nixon's just in the back as Deborah Kerr is on stage.
That would be a trip. I would love to see it. Speaking of which, a little bit, this is from Nikki. 3 of these films have also had musical adaptations on stage. 2 of them are very good. Parentheses, sorry, Anastasia. We agree on that. Who would you cast today to star in movie musical adaptations of all 5? And by star, I mean actually sing, no auto-tune or questionable vocals. So I saw this question ahead of time, so I did write down a few answers.
Yeah, you start. I'm going to formulate this.
So I've made this comparison many times already on this show, but I say Amy Adams in The King and I.
That's a good one.
Because I often compare her to Deborah Kerr. I went with for the bad seed, I decided to do Emily Blunt.
Oh, that's a good one too.
I think that would be fun for her. She does horror well, and I assume she can sing. Obviously, she's done Into the Woods and stuff like that. If we're doing a bad seed musical would be Unhinged. And I have, for the Rainmaker, I decided to go with someone you already mentioned, Toni Collette.
It's a good one.
How about that? And then for the other two, I just went completely off the board. I decided for Anastasia to go with Joanna Kulig, who did Cold War. And for Baby Doll, I had no idea where to go with that one. So I just settled on a great up-and-coming star of today. I don't really know if she could sing, but I went with Jenna Ortega.
Love that.
Yes. So those were the ones that I came up with. I don't know if you came up with any on your own.
Okay. So for The King and I think that Emily Blunt would also be a potentially good backup because, she's British already.
That's true.
For the bad seed, let's do Cynthia Erivo.
Ooh. Love
that. For the Rainmaker, she is not a traditional singer, but would love to see someone like Betty Gilpin play a Midwestern spinster.
Love to see it.
Anastasia, let's go with someone like Rebecca Hall, because we know that she can hold a tune. Her mom was also an opera singer, so let's do that. And then Baby Doll is so tricky because I don't know many Gen Z people. So
right.
That's why
I also struggled.
Let's go with Caitlin Dever because she can also sing.
Wow.
We know that she can act. Let's make that happen.
I really like your choices more than mine.
This is chaos. My choices are chaos.
They're inspired, I would say. So I love that. Yeah, would love to see any of those interpretations. So let's see. Ayrton O'Brien said, Giulietta Messina, where? I think this is one of the downsides of only covering the 5 performances nominated for Best Actress, because it sort of prevents us from really delving into the wealth of really excellent work being done in non-English language films. Mm-hmm. And I think Giulietta Messina, in La Strada is a great example of that. And it's a fair question because the film did get in for writing and for foreign language film. But, it's really the same answer I'll probably give for other non-English language performances, which is that there's just a barrier there, especially at that time. It feels like we're only just now starting to get to a place of embracing these more, non-English language films, like 70 years later. So,
yeah. Because I think Roberto Benigni might be one of the earliest ones where someone actually won an acting category in another language, and then Marion Cotillard for La Vie en Rose might be the first one that I ever witnessed, and that was 2007.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Another one from our friend Chelsea, who said, not an actress, but is honorary hot girl Rock Hudson the hottest of them all?
He's hot. So. But I also really loved James Dean in that movie, and Giant as well. Yeah. And Dennis Hopper was also pretty cute.
Yeah, there's a lot of hotties in that one.
A lot of hotties.
And would you nominate Liz Taylor? She says, my winner, for Giant, and who would you kick out for her?
Yeah,
I might nominate her. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I have to look at an alternative lineup for me, because I definitely put in Giulietta Messina at the very least. On a good day, sure, I would consider nominating Liz. Would probably be a better debut nomination than the one we'll talk about next week. I'll just say that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you recently watched Giant, so what do you think?
Yeah, I think that Liz would have been a great alternative, especially considering some of these films aren't super strong. I also really loved problematic fave Joan Crawford in Autumn Leaves, because talk about a wild film. She's giving a lot. She and Nancy Kelly probably would have had a fun time that award season together for those wildly inappropriate films.
Yes. Okay, last one from Owen Daly. I know it's not a nominated performance, but please take some time to discuss Deborah Kerr's other 1956 feature, Tea and Sympathy. I've been recommended to watch this movie on several occasions, but this finally gave me a good opportunity to actually watch it. I literally watched it hours ago before this recording.
Wow, same.
You watched it too?
Yeah, because I actually saw that question beforehand and said, I'm going to watch this.
You did your homework. I love it. I loved it. I thought it's a really good movie, really affecting. It's about a young man at a college who's very sensitive and has these more effeminate qualities, and he's bullied by his peers, and he is befriending the wife of a faculty member, and they have this connection. Really beautiful and fascinating to watch a film that is dealing pretty directly, without really saying it, but probably a gay character in the lead who's struggling to fit in and finding this woman who sympathizes with him and cares for him, and that we're meant to be on her side, and like tackling all of these things about masculinity in the 50s. Really well done, and Deborah Kerr is excellent in it. I loved it. Yeah,
it was a great performance by Deborah Kerr, and I think that also the film suffers a little bit from the censors, of course. So that would have also been interesting to have that in conversation with something like The Bad Seed, that also had to alter its original ending to appease the censors, because I really like the idea of a woman who not only sympathizes with a young man who's struggling with his sexuality, but also being a woman who wants to understand and explore her own sexuality, because she's with all of these young men, and she has a very absent husband, and she's questioning what masculinity is and how it plays a role in her life as well. And so I think there's a cop out at the end where she regrets everything, and it's like, no, I don't think in real life she would regret everything, because she deserves to not only feel affection for others, but have others feel affection for her. So yeah, it was a surprising film and a great performance.
Yeah, and I don't know if this is a super hot take, but I think I maybe would have nominated her for this instead of The King and I. She has a lot of performances that she wasn't nominated for that she is excellent in. So obviously we highly recommend Deborah Kerr in the 50s. Okay, well, let's get to our final segment, where we will discuss who we think was the runner-up to Ingrid Bergman. Morgan, what do you think? Who's the runner-up here?
I mean, my heart tells me Nancy Kelly, but my reality tells me Deborah Kerr, because I think Nancy Kelly is a bold, wild choice that I personally love. But if you look at what the Academy would also be keeping in consideration, I think for sure Deborah Kerr would have actually been a contender in comparison to the other nominees.
I mean, if you're looking at this from a horse race perspective, if I'm imagining myself in 1956 and I'm seeing Deborah Kerr in The King and I, it's like she's out in front with that performance. And then it's like Ingrid Bergman comes along with this incredible comeback narrative, and she just outpaces her because of the strength of that narrative. Yeah. That's kind of how I consider this race. And I do agree that Deborah Kerr was almost definitely the runner-up here, although I do think if there were some, new Hollywood people in the Academy, I could have seen some gravitating to Carroll Baker, Nancy Kelly, possibly, because it is such a over-the-top kind of performance. The only one I can't really see is Katharine Hepburn. I don't think she had a strong enough narrative there. But yeah, I think so. We agree Deborah Kerr was the runner-up. But who would you have voted for from this lineup if you had the chance?
Oh, for sure, Nancy Kelly. The movie is so great, and she's really who we follow that entire time. And even with her big choices, you can't help but be like, this is incredible work.
Yeah, that's a really good choice. Personally, I think I would have just voted for Deborah Kerr.
That's a good one too, though.
Yeah, I think I would probably be on a similar track as I currently am with Glenn Close, which is this feeling of like, when are we going to reward this woman? She's been putting in the work for years now, and this is only her third nomination. Eventually she'll get 6, but still, it's like, this feels like the time that it probably should have happened for Deborah Kerr. So I think I would have been on board that train. I would be in Team Deborah this year. But I really love Carroll Baker. I really was pleasantly surprised on this rewatch with Nancy Kelly. That's about it. Those would be the 3 that I would be in consideration for, but Deb would get my vote. So there you go. Thank you so much, Morgan, for coming on and doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. This has been a great time.
Yes, absolutely. And tell the people where they can find more of you on the internet.
Yeah. So you can find me on Twitter and Letterboxd at NSMLRoberts, and all of my work tends to go up there on the Twitter. So go ahead and check that out. I also tweet a lot about Xanadu. So hope you enjoy that chaos as well.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you all so much for listening. You can find me on Twitter at Kevin_Jacobson, and the show's at Oscar Runner Up, Instagram at And the Runner Up Is. Rate, review, and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you liked what you heard and want to hear more, go to patreon.com/AndTheRunnerUpIs, where you can hear a whole bunch of bonus episodes. And next week, we'll be covering the 1957 Best Actress race. The nominees were Deborah Kerr for Heaven Knows Mr. Allison, Anna Magnani for Wild is the Wind, Elizabeth Taylor for Raintree County, Lana Turner for Peyton Place, and Joanne Woodward for The Three Faces of Eve, with the winner being Joanne Woodward. So that's what to watch before next episode. Thanks again, Morgan. And with that, I will bid you all adieu.